All right, so we're going to build a small CRUD app with one resource called students. So I'm going to start by making a directory called student app. And I'm going to cd into that student app. And the first thing we want to do is make a virtual environment. So I'm going to mk virtual env, and we can call that first student app. And we'll give that a second to install. We're going to get Python 3 here, and then we're going to make sure to install any dependencies that we need. So now that I'm inside of here, let's pip install Flask and Ipython. And we'll use Ipython for any debugging if we need, and Flask is what we're going to be using to handle routing and build this application. Great, we got that installed. Let's think about our folder structure. So I'm going to want to make sure I have a directory called templates, and I'm going to make sure that I have a file called app.py. And inside of this templates folder, I am going to make a few files. We're going to make a base, an index, a new, a show, and an edit.html. All right, let's go back here for a second, take a quick look at what our folder structure looks like. If you don't have tree, you can brew install tree. Really useful to see your folder structure. Great, let's hop into Sublime and start building this application. Now, inside of here, in my app.py, I'm going to start with the basics of a Flask application. So from Flask, I'm going to import the Flask class. I'm then going to make a variable called app and initialize my Flask class using $name. I'm just going to make a quick check to see if name is main, and if so, I'm going to start this application. I'm going to make sure that debug is true, and let's put this on port 3000. I just find that a little bit easier to work with. Now, we need to build an application that's going to create students. And this idea of a student is going to come from some kind of class. And we could put all of that logic in our app.py, but what we're going to see later on is this idea of a model or a way to represent our data. So I'm actually going to make a new file, and I'm going to call that student.py. And inside of this class, we're going to do a little bit of work around making a student object from some kind of class. So we're going to make a class for a student. And we're going to make a special method called $init. This is the method that gets run every time that class gets initialized. So we'll have a first name, and we'll have a last name for each one of these. And I'm going to want to make sure that my first name is going to be that first name property. Do the same thing for last name. And I also want to make sure that each student gets some kind of ID. This is going to be really useful to find specific students and remove specific students, but I need to keep track of some kind of ID. So in my class, I'm actually going to make a property called count and assign that to 1. And the ID is going to start at whatever the count is for that student. And then I'm going to make sure that I increment that ID. Student.count plus equals 1. Remember, if you're coming from JavaScript, we can't do plus plus in Python. So we're going to plus equals 1. And this looks pretty good. This is going to be my simple class that I'm going to use to make students. And now I need to use it in my app.py. So if I want to go bring that specific student class, I need to import it. So from student, I'm going to import that student class. And now I have that student class. I'm not using it yet, but it's going to be very helpful with my students. I'm going to start also with a list of students. Now this would usually be where we would go to the database and grab our students, but right now we're going to keep things really, really simple. Let's start building some of the CRUD functionality. Since I'm using Flask, I'm going to need a couple more things. I'm going to need request to get data from a form. I'm going to need redirect if I want to redirect after doing things like creating or updating or deleting. I want that nice URL4 helper so that I don't have to hard code my URLs. And I'm going to want render template to make sure that if I'm rendering a Jinja template, I have the right method to do that. And you can see my linter is yelling at me because I'm just not using these yet, but I will be soon. So we're going to start with our first route. And this is going to be a route to the root route. And inside of here, we're going to make a method called root, which is going to return a redirect URL4 index. What does this mean right here? When you go to the root route, when you go to localhost 3000 or localhost 3000 / this is called the root route, we're going to run this function right here, which is going to redirect us to whatever the URL is for a function or a view function called index. Well, I don't have that yet, so let's make it. We're going to decorate app again, invoke the route method, and here we're going to go to /students. Now, right now, you might not have an understanding of why we're going to use these specific conventions for naming our routes, but this is something that you'll learn about later called Restful Routing. It's very important that you standardize on the name of your routes when working with other people. So /students is going to be the ability for me to get all of the students. It's also going to be the place where I actually create students. So I'm going to specify a keyword argument of methods. These will be the different HTTP verbs that I can use, get and post. We're not too worried about post yet. Let's just focus on get. And what do we need to call this function? Well, remember, we're doing a URL for index. So we're going to write a method called index. And inside of here, what do we want to do? Let's just start with something really simple. We're going to return render template. And what is the name of the template that we want to use? We want to use index.html. And index.html is going to be my template right over here that's going to render all of my students. But in order to do that, I need to pass some data from my app.py to that index.html. And we do that by passing in keyword arguments to render template. I'm going to pass in a keyword argument called students with a value of students. That may look a little strange, but this students right here refers to that list. This students right here is going to refer to a variable in my index.html. Now, before I jump and fill out my index.html, we want to make sure that we fill out our base.html. That way I don't have to copy this boilerplate into all of my documents. So I'm going to hop over to my base.html. If you're on a Mac, that's Command P to jump to files. And inside of my base.html, we'll keep it simple. Let's just make a title of first Flask app. And inside of the body, we're going to make a little bit of Jinja. We're going to add a block of content. And we're going to make sure that we end that block. All we're really doing here is just putting in some boilerplate for all of our templates to extend from. So I'm going to grab all this code and I'm going to move to my index.html. And now inside of my index.html, how do I possibly get all the code from my base.html? I'm going to use the extends keyword. I'm going to extends, make sure you have this in quotes, base.html. What this is going to do is bring over all that nice boilerplate. I'm then going to open up a block for content. I'm going to make sure that I end that block. Now inside of here, I'm going to do something really simple and just write see all the students. We've been working a lot in Sublime. Let's actually see if this code is running correctly. So what I'm going to do is run Python app.py. I'm going to move this over right here. Going to head over to the browser. And I'm going to go to localhost 3000. And when we go to localhost 3000, you can see that we're redirecting to /students. That's fantastic because we've already placed a redirect for going to the root route and immediately taking me to /students. We don't have to do that, but it's going to be a little bit easier when we start thinking about what routes trigger what specific action. So I'm rendering the right template. If we actually look inside the Chrome DevTools in the Elements tab, we can see I have this specific information that I want. I have my head tag, first Flask app. This is all coming from the base.html. I can see the title is triggering correctly with first Flask app. That looks great. So what's next? Let's head back to Sublime. And inside of here, I want to render all of the students in that list. So to do that, I'm going to use a little bit of Jinja syntax. And this is very similar to a for loop in Python. I'll say for something in students. This something, I can call it whatever I want. I think student is a good name. For student in students, what are we going to do? Always make sure you end that for. Now inside of here, let's make a paragraph tag. And we'll say something like student.firstname and student.lastname. Now, right now, I don't have any students, and that's okay. But when I have students, it's going to print out the first name property and the last name property. Remember, back in our student class, every student is going to have a first name and a last name. That's where I'm getting that from. Right now, nothing's really going to print out, and that's okay, because I don't really have any students at the moment. So in order to do that, I need to make a form to add some new students. So I'm going to save this, and I'm going to make an anchor tag, and I'm going to go to URL for, and what's the name of the function that I want? I'm going to call it new. We don't have this yet. We're going to have to set this up in our app.py, but that's okay. And I'm going to add a new student. So if I head back to the browser just to see what this looks like, it's going to tell me could not build URL endpoint for new. What's really nice about using URL for is you get these really nice error messages. Did you mean index instead? Actually, I meant new, but I don't have one yet. So I'm going to head back to my app.py. And what are we going to do here? We're going to make another route. And this we can call whatever we want, but let's try to stick to this convention called Restful Routing, which we'll learn a little bit more later. So right now, just try to memorize what these routes look like. Students/new. And I don't really need to specify a methods of get, because by default, that's what we're going to have. So I'm going to take that out. And inside of here, I'm going to make a method called new. And what am I going to do inside of here? I'm just going to return a new template. Render template new.html. I don't need to pass any information to this template. So all I really need to stick with right now is this new.html. So what's next? Just like before, let's go to our new.html. And what do we need to put inside of here? Well, if you think about what our new.html is going to have, first off, we need to extend, once again, base.html. Want to get all that boilerplate in there. Always make sure you have quotes around that base.html. And then we're going to end this block that we're going to make. And let's go make that block. And what do we call that? We call that block content. How can we call that content? Remember, in our base.html, that's what we're using right here. You can think of block content as just something that we're going to plug in right between the body tag. And how do we determine where that goes? Make a block and end it. Now, what do we need inside of our form? We'll make a very simple H1 that's going to say something like add a new student. And here we need a form. Now, what is the action for this form? We could do something like /students, but remember, we're going to try to use URL4 as much as possible so we can get those really nice error messages if something goes wrong. So we're going to open this up and we're going to say URL4. Now, what is the action or the view function that is going to make new students? Well, if you remember, that's actually index. But here we're going to be using a method of post. So back in our new, we're going to do a URL for index. And what other attribute do we need to specify that's very important? We need a method. And the method here is going to be post. Now inside of our form, we're going to make a bunch of inputs. I'm using emit right here. So input :t, that's going to give me a text input. And what's really important to make sure that I have is a name attribute. The name attribute is how we're going to get data sent to the server. So we're going to add a first name. We're going to add a last name. And these IDs would be important if we were making labels or maybe targeting things with CSS. We're going to keep it really simple now, but you should always have labels in your form. It's very important for things like accessibility. I'll make an input once again with the type of submit. You could use a button here, and that's totally fine. Either one is going to do the trick. We're going to make an input with the type of submit, and our value will be add student. So what's this look like? Let's head over back again to the browser. Let's go to /students, and now we can build that endpoint. If you look over here, localhost 3000 /students/new, I'll click on that. And here I have this great looking form. We're not going to worry too much about the CSS, but I do encourage you to really make this look better because this is pretty awful at the moment. So what happens when I add a new student? We'll add Ellie, Shopik, and what happened? You might be wondering, how could I possibly debug this? Let's take a look at the network tab. And let's see what happens when we submit this form. So I'll add a new student, a 200. That's great. We'll say Ellie, Shopik. And when I add a new student, something just flashed for a second. Well, what just flashed for a second was that post request that we were making to our app.py. But the problem is we have no logic here to handle a post request. So what do we need to do? Well, let's add that logic. We're going to say if the method is post. Remember, the method right here is that method that we're specifying here. Well, if it's post, what should we do? We need a little bit of logic to create that specific student. So what I'm going to do right now is actually put in an Ipython because I want to examine what data is coming to the server and how we can get that data. So let's head over back to the browser and we'll go to add a new student. And this time we're going to add Ellie Shopik. I'm going to add that student. And when I add that student, we can see Ipython has popped up. Now, what do I really want to see inside of here? I want to take a quick look at request. And remember, request is what we're getting from Flask right here. And inside of request, we get a really nice data structure called form. Immutable, multi-dict, that sounds really intimidating, but it's important to know that you can't modify data inside of this list right here, because you don't want to actually change the request. That's data that's coming in. You don't want to mess with that. If we want to get data from request.form, we can access it, just like we would with keys in a dictionary. But remember, that might be a bit of trouble because we'll actually get a key error. This will actually return a 400. So if you see something like a bad request or a 400, it's actually coming because you're trying to access something in request that doesn't exist. If we were to then quit out of here, we would actually see inside of the browser, we're not really getting much. So let's try this again. We're going to add Ellie Shopik, and let's see how we can get that data. Inside of request.form, we can access it using this simple syntax right here, or we can use the get function. And if you try to get something that doesn't exist, you simply get none back. So this might be a better way to try to access things without immediately throwing some kind of error, but either one is up to you. We're going to be really explicit here, and if something goes wrong, we're going to see an error, but you might want to use get instead if you want to be a little bit safer. So inside of here, what do we need to do? We're going to make some kind of new student. So we'll say new student is going to be the result of the student class being invoked. And when the student class is being invoked, there are two parameters that we have to specify. Think back to our student class. We need the first name and the last name. Where is that data coming from? Request.form, first name, and request.form of last name. You might be wondering, where does last name and where does first name come from? That actually comes from the name attribute right here. If you don't have that name attribute inside of your new.html, you're going to be in a lot of trouble. So you really want to make sure you have that information. What am I going to do next? I made this new student instance, but I want to add that to my list of students. So we're going to get our list of students right here, and we're going to append that new student. Now, right now, this is where we go to a database and store this data on a more persistent basis, but we're just using a list right now to keep it really, really simple. I want to focus on learning routing and building CRUD and routing before you actually go on and add things to the database. So we're going to append that, and then we're going to return a redirect. And where do we want to go back to? Let's go back to index. And you might be wondering, well, how does it know if it's a get or a post when you do URL for? The answer is it's always a get. When you redirect, you're always going to submit a final get request to this route right here. So let's see if that works. I'm going to go to localhost 3000/students. I'm going to add a new student. Let's add me. Click add student, and great, there I am. Now, what you want to be careful of is if you were to stop the server, Control C to do that, I'm just going to close this entire window. If I were to then go back and open up another terminal window, we have to make sure inside of student app, if I were to run, we're going to work on first student app, and then we're going to run python app.py. If I were to refresh the page, notice that Ellie's gone. And the reason is we're using a list to store this information that's in memory. So if the server goes down, we're going to lose that information. It's really why we would use something like a database. Just watch out for that right now. All right, so right now we have a simple application where we can create a specific student. We can see right here, I'll add Ellie again. Remember, we're using a list right now. So if we were to take down the server and start it up again, we would lose this information. But right now we can create students and we can read all of the students. Let's say I want to make a page for a specific student. We'll call this some kind of show action. So what I'm going to do is make another route. We're going to make a route. And where is this going to go? This is going to go to /students/ and I'll just give a little more room here. What do I really want? I want to go to some specific ID. Now this would work totally fine, but remember that this would come in as a string. So what we're going to do is coerce that string into an int. It's going to make life much easier when finding by a specific kind of ID. Now inside of this right here, what do I want to do? I'm going to make a method and we'll call that show. And remember that show is going to accept a parameter called ID. If you don't actually pass that in, it's going to give you an error. So be really mindful that you pass that in. In fact, I'm actually going to take that out so we can see what that error looks like. And what I'm going to do here is just return a template called show.html. I'm actually not going to get to this line right here. I want to show you what this error looks like. So I'm going to go make sure my server is running. We'll do Python, if I can spell Python correctly, app.py. We'll start up the server, go to /students. I'm going to add a student, and we'll call that Ellie Shopik. And now I need to go to students / some kind of ID, maybe 1. Now, 1 worked because that was simply the first student that I made each time. But we're going to have to find a smarter way to figure out that right number so that we're not guessing. But what do we get? Show got an unexpected keyword argument ID. The reason why that's happening is because we're not passing in this specific ID right here. It thinks there's supposed to be some argument ID, but we didn't pass it in. So let's save that, refresh the page, and now I'm rendering a template called show.html. The problem is inside of show.html, there's not much. So what do we need to do? Once again, extends base.html. Going to open up a block content. We're going to add a end block. And if you're wondering what this right here does for me, this JJ, this is a snippet that I made. So you can take a look at how to make snippets in Sublime. It's a really helpful way to not have to code this right here and make sure you get the right character. So all I'm doing is making a couple snippets. I have one called JJ, and I have one to make those specific actions. So what are we going to do inside of this block content? Well, why don't we see some information about, and here I want to get the student's first name. But in order to use this student variable, I need to pass it to the template. But I just want one specific student here. So there are a couple ways that I could do that. I could make a variable called foundStudent. And maybe instead of that, I'm going to loop over all my students. For student in students, we'll say if student.id is the same as ID, then foundStudent is going to be that specific student. So what am I doing right here? I'm going through all of my students in the list. I'm checking to see if the ID property on that student is the same ID that we passed in. And if it is, I'm going to make a variable called foundStudent. And I'm then going to pass in student as foundStudent. Student right here, remember this is what I'm using inside of my show.html. So let's save this and see what it does. I'll refresh the page. And what are we getting? Local variable foundStudent reference before assignment. So what could be the issue here? I'm using some kind of variable, foundStudent, and then I'm returning it right over here. So the reason why this is happening is because I don't actually have a student of 1 right now. So what I'm going to do is go back to student/new, because my server restarted, and I'll add Ellie once again. Remember, this problem will go away once we have a database. But if I go to student/1 right now, I could see some information about Ellie. Now, this code right here is a little bit messy. If I wanted to show a specific student, we'd have to loop through each time. So is there a way that we can clean this up? Well, we could use list comprehension. Why don't we say that foundStudent is going to be student for students in students if student.id is ID. I'll close this up for a second so we can see this on one line. And this is going to return a list to me, and I'll get the first thing in that list. So I can actually take this out right here. I'll save that. Let's refresh the page. And it's going to tell me list index out of range. So what did I do wrong here? Well, let's go make sure once again that we have our students, and we don't. So I'm going to add a new student. I'm going to add Ellie Shopik. Remember, every time that we save, our server is restarting. So we're actually going to lose that data. It's a little bit frustrating, but it'll go away once we start using a database. And here we get the same kind of thing. If you're unfamiliar with list comprehension, make sure you go back in the curriculum and take a look at how that works. But there's one more thing that we can do. This code right here, we might end up using quite a bit if I want to edit a specific student, or maybe I just want some way to find it. So what I'm going to do is actually move this logic out of here, and I'm going to make a method called findStudent. It's going to accept some kind of ID, and it's going to return that specific student. I can now use this findStudent function somewhere else. You might be wondering why ID is highlighted. That's because that's actually a special keyword in Python. We can use it right now, but it might be better to call this something like student ID. Just to show you what ID is, I'm going to quickly stop the server. I'll open up a quick Python 3 REPL, and ID is actually a built-in function that we can use to give us the ID of specific values. You're not going to use this too much, but just know it's actually something specific in Python. Start the server up again. We're going to have to make that student just like we did last time, but I'll go to students/new. Once again, I'll add me. And inside of here, I have Ellie Shopik. But the problem here is I'm going to get an error if I try to go to my show page. If I try to go to student/1, it's not going to be too happy. Found student is not defined. So I'm going to say that found student is the result of our find student function. And we're going to pass in the specific ID that we're getting back right here. Let's save this, go back and make sure that we make a new student. I'll add Ellie Shopik, add that student, and here we are. Let's go take a look at that student, and I can see some information about Ellie. But I still have to keep going to /1. I still have to guess that it's the right ID. So it might be better if we actually went to our index page and we made this right here a link. We're going to make this a link. And where is it going to go to? It's going to go to a URL for show. The problem here is show actually accepts a keyword argument called ID. And its value is going to be student.id, whatever value we've specified for this student. Let's save this and refresh the page. Add a new student. And let's take a look at Ellie Shopik. In the Chrome DevTools, let's see exactly what this looks like. It's hard-coded URL for show. So what did I do wrong here? Maybe you spotted this. Have to actually use Jinja to evaluate that value. So I'll save that, refresh the page. And now that looks much better. It's actually going to student/1. This ID right here, where's that come from? In our app.py, that's the keyword argument. When you use URL for and it accepts keyword arguments, you have to make sure you pass those in after the URL for. You're going to make this mistake a lot. It takes some practice. That's okay. So now I'm going to the show page for Ellie. What I'd like to do on this show page is add a little functionality to edit this specific student. So how am I going to do that? I'm going to make another link. On this show page, I'm going to make an anchor tag, and that's going to go to URL for, I don't have this one yet, but let's call it edit. And since we're going to need to edit a specific student, we're going to want to make sure that we get some student that we're working with. So we'll say student.id, and we'll say edit this student. We're also later on going to need to delete this student. So maybe we'll add a little note that says, delete this student. Not going to do it yet. Let's work on edit first. But remember, we want full CRUD, creating, reading, updating, and deleting. If I refresh the page, going to get that same error. Could not build URL for endpoint edit. Did you mean new? We've seen this one before. We get this routing error when we don't actually have that route. So back in our app.py, let's go make a route. And where's this one going to go? /students /sum ID /edit. This is the RESTful route. If you're not sure what that term is, that's okay. You're going to read about it a little bit later, but really try to structure your routes this way that we're doing it so far. You may be wondering, how come it's this way? You just got to follow the convention. It's going to be very useful when working with other developers because you can call this whatever you want. You want to make sure it's consistent, especially when working on a larger team. So we'll make a function called edit. And edit, once again, is going to accept ID. Where's that coming from? Same thing as here before. We need to make sure that when we edit a student, we edit the right one, which means that we need to find a specific student. Now remember that this edit function is not going to actually change things about the student. What it's going to do is simply just render a form to edit that student. Just like new, we're not actually going to be doing any of the creation here or editing here. We're simply just going to return a template. Return, render template. This one's going to be called edit.html, but I want to pass in some student. How do I get that student? Same thing as here. I'm going to go find that specific student, and I'm going to pass it to that template. You could call this whatever you'd like. Just make sure these two match. You could call this me. I wouldn't do that, but you could call this student if you wanted as well. I'm just making these different, so it's really explicit as to which one's which. Student is something we're going to be using in our edit.html. What does that mean right now? Well, we got to go build that edit.html. Command P, jump to that file. First thing we do, extends. What are we extending? Base.html. Always make sure you have that in quotes. Same kind of thing again, block content, so that we can get all that information, and then we're going to end that block. And what do we want to do inside of our edit? Well, we're going to make a form. Better yet, let's make a really explicit H1 that says edit this student. We'll make a form. And where is this form going to go? This form is going to go to show. But you might be wondering, I already have a URL for show, So what method do I want to use here? And this is where it's going to get a little bit tricky. First off, we're going to make sure we get the right student ID. And before we worry about fixing that method issue, let's just build this form. So I'm going to have an input with text. I'm going to have 2 of those. Remember, you always need that name attribute, first name and last name. This is the data that I want sent to my server. I'm not going to worry too much about IDs here, but I'm going to make an input with a type of submit. And the value here is going to be edit student. Now, if I look at this form, I should be able to go to students/1. Let's make sure that the server is started. So let's go back here. And let's go to Python app.py. Let's go back. We're not going to have students1, so I'm going to make that student again. I'll say that's Ellie Shopik. Let's go click on Ellie. And here, let's click on edit this student. And what we see right here is a form that says edit the student, but it's not the most helpful because I'd really like these values to be populated with the student's information. And the way to do that is to use the value attribute. And the value that I'm going to use is going to be this student, its first name property. I want to make sure I got that in quotes as well. I'm going to do the same thing to make sure that I get the student's last name property, student.last name. Let's save that, refresh the page, and great. Data is already filled in. This is a very common behavior you're going to see with forms. You really want to have that information for the user so that they don't have to put in everything again, because this is actually something that exists already. But here comes the fun part. When I click edit student, where's it going to go? Well, if you remember back with your HTTP verbs, get is used to retrieve data or send data to the server in the query string. Post is used to create, but there actually is a better method to update a specific resource. In fact, there are 2 HTTP verbs to do that. There's put, which is to modify the entire resource, or the verb, or the noun that we're working on, or patch, which is meant to patch up or change small parts of some kind of resource that we're working on. So which one do we want to use? We're going to use patch. It's not going to make a difference, but it's recommended that you use patch when updating just parts of a specific resource. Remember, the resource is just the noun that we're operating on. What are we operating on? Students. So once again, we always want a method of post. But we're going to need some way to override this method. And this is where it gets a little bit tricky. HTML forms are not the smartest at the moment. We can't just do patch right here. All that forms know are get and post. So what we need to do is introduce some kind of tool that's going to override this method. And to do that, we're going to use a module called Flask Modus. So we're going to pip install Flask Modus. We're going to give that a second. And we're then going to start up our server again. What we need to do when using something like Modus is first import it. From Flask Modus, we're going to import the Modus class. You can see we're not using it right now, so let's use it. We can make a variable called Modus. You don't have to do this, but what you need to do is instantiate the Modus class and pass in our app. What this is going to do is add the necessary ability for us to override the default method. This is also known as method overriding. So if you're coming from something like Node, you may have seen method override. This is the same exact kind of idea. So what are we doing here? We need to make sure in our edit.html that we don't actually post, we want to patch. And one of the ways that you can override the method is by passing in information in the query string. So how do we make a query string? We start with a question mark, and we're going to add a key of underscore method and a value of patch. This is from the Flask Modus documentation to make sure that we override the method correctly. So I'm going to save this, and I'm going to go back to editing a student. It's going to yell at me because I don't have that yet. So let's go to student/new. Once again, we'll add me. If you find yourself kind of getting frustrated with the fact that we don't have a student each time, you can always just start with some specific student. So we could make a student, and we could just start with Ellie and Shopik. So every time that I restart the server, I'll actually have Ellie Shopik right here. You might want to do that. Maybe don't use Ellie Shopik, maybe use your name. But this is a good way to not have to make it every single time. We also call this seeding. You'll find this a lot when you work with a database and lots of data. So I'm going to start each time with a student called Ellie Shopik. Maybe you're doing this already. That's great. I'll click on Ellie. I'll then edit this student. And I'm going to change my name to Ellie with a bunch of E's at the end. And I'm going to edit the student. Now what's nice about here is you can see that the method is patch. If I actually open up the Chrome DevTools, it's going to tell me that the method was not allowed. I'm going to hop back to the network tab so we can see exactly what kind of requests we're making. I'm going to edit that student. And if we open this up just a little bit more, click on this, we can see we're sending a post, but we're actually adding that method of patch right here. Well, the method's not allowed because we don't have anywhere on the server that's handling a patch. So how do we do that? Well, we got to make sure in our app.py that we have the right logic to handle a patch. So where do we go? Back to our app.py. And inside of here, inside of show, we're going to add a little bit of logic to see if, and first let's make sure we get the right student. If request.method is patch, what do we want to do? Well, we want to actually modify this student. Found student.firstName is going to be whatever came in the form. Request.form of first name. I'm going to Command-Shift-D. I'm on a Mac. I'm going to highlight this, Command-D, and just replace last name. What do I then want to make sure that I do? Well, I want to finish. So I'm going to return redirect URL for, and let's just go back to index right now. So if this all goes well and the method is patch, we should modify information about that student and then go back to index, which is going to show us all the students. Let's try that out. I'm going to go to localhost 3000/students. Make sure I don't have that leading slash. You can fix that, but watch out for it. Let's click on Ellie Shopik. Let's edit the student. Let's go add a bunch of exclamation marks after my name. We'll edit the student and the method is not allowed for requested URL. Well, you might be wondering what's going on here. What methods am I allowing right here? Only get right now. Let's make sure we add get as well as patch. Now the method can be allowed for this route. Back to students, back to Ellie. Let's go edit the student. Let's try this one more time and what happened here? It just took me to this method of patch. Well, let's see what's going on here. I'm going to throw an Ipython and see what happens when this form is submitted. Let's go back to /students. Make sure I get that slash out of there. I'll make sure this is saved. And let's go to Ellie and let's try to edit Ellie again. Well, when I go to the show page, I'm in an Ipython, so I'm going to get out of that for a second. I'm then going to edit this student. I'm going to edit, and let's take a look back in Ipython at request.method. You might be wondering what this B is right here. If I look at request.method and compare it to patch, it's actually going to be false. And that's because the way that Flask modus uses the string is it converts it to what's called a byte string. And what that means is that we need to convert this string to a byte string, a string of literal bytes. Unfortunately, this is because Flask modus is mostly involved with Python 2. There have been some patches to try to update that, but it's not done yet. So this may change, but for now we have to actually make this a byte string. So I'm going to take out that Ipython. Let's see if this fixes our problem. We'll go back to /students. We'll go to Ellie. We'll edit the student. We'll add a bunch of exclamation marks, and there we go. Whew. Quite a bit of work just to edit the student, but there's some important things that you need to see here. First, you have to make sure that whatever you're overriding with is a byte string. In order to successfully override, we have to use Flask modus. In order to tell the form to override the method, we have to add it in the query string. And finally, to make sure we do this correctly, we have to make sure we have the right logic when we patch. So that's quite a bit of work to edit, but the more that you do this, the easier it's going to get. Fortunately, we only have one more thing to do, and that's deleting. So let's finish strong. What we want to do back on our show page is delete the student. And when we delete a student, we need a form to do that. So I'm going to make a form. And where's this going to go? It's actually going to go to URL for show once again. And we're going to grab the correct ID. And we need to make sure that we override this method as well. And what is the HTTP verb that we're going to use? We're going to use delete. And all that we really want inside of this form is an input with a type of submit and a value. Let's just use an X. So first off, let's see what this looks like. I'm going to save this, going to refresh the page, go back to student/1, and that's our form. That's it right there. If we take a look in the Elements tab, we can see all we have is a form that goes to student/1 with a method of delete. Now, what I'd like you to do is try to guess what will happen when I click on this X. Think about it. Well, method not allowed. We've seen this before. How do we fix it? Back in the app.py, let's go to our methods that we allow. And what do we need now? We need delete. Great. So if we have this method, we need a little bit of logic to handle what will happen when we delete. So we can say if request.method is delete. Now hold on a second. There's something I did wrong here. Remember that Flask modus needs a byte string. So make sure we add that B right there. Now, if it's delete, how do we remove this specific student from the list? Well, we can use the wonderful remove method. We're going to remove found student. And then we're going to return a redirect URL for. And where are we going here? We're going back to index again. So let's save this. Let's go back to students and make sure that my server is starting. Sometimes if there's a syntax error, it will crash the server. So always make sure your server's up and running. We'll go to Python app.py, start the server again, click on Eli Shopik. Let's get rid of me. Great, and we can see that we don't have that student anymore. If I add a new student, let's add Matt. If I take a look at this right here, it's student/2. I'm taking a look right down there. So check that out, student/2. The class is allowing each student ID to increment whenever I make that student. If I change Matt to Matt, same kind of thing, that works great. So what do I have right now? I have CRUD functionality on a Flask app. I'm moving through this stuff pretty quickly, but try to implement this again on your own and follow along with the video when you get stuck with something. I'll see you in the next screencast.